For the first time in a while, the metagame in Marvel Snap is wide open. Here are some decks from top 100 infinite players that I think can have tremendous success in the right hands for you. We are going to start with Nightmare. Now, I think by this point, most people are familiar with the normal version of Ramp, and they are familiar with the power output that it can have. But what they're not familiar with is that this might just be a straight upgrade on that deck. I think a lot of people look at Ramp, the Ramp deck, as a finished product. That's what it is, and this is just like a variant that people play for fun. It ain't that. There are going to be games where this is just a significantly stronger deck. It has a lot more surprise ability in it, and it has a much higher ceiling because of the way the Ramp deck functions. The biggest weakness that the Ramp deck has is a very limited amount of output in very known ways. That 7 energy that you have is not going to be any more than an Infinite and an Ebony Maw. And in a fair game of Marvel Snap, that's a reasonable thing to have as your top-end threat. But the more unfair the metagame gets, the more this deck becomes a more advantaged version of the list. Now, there are some trade-offs here. When you play this version of the list, you are going to be giving up a Cosmic Ghost Rider, a Legion, those subpar bodies at their cost. You will get to keep Enchantress because her body is great at 5/8, but there are some costs applied here that aren't necessarily negligible. However, you gain this incredible amount of unsustainably weird gameplay. And I phrase it that way to say, this is a deck that is not going to consistently output a jillion points, but it will consistently probably do something really stupid between Starbrand at 3 with your Nightmare and your very expensive and powerful top end. There are so many options for incredibly stupid ceiling raisers that you have in this list, and I think what this deck does is it takes an already solid core and adds an element of high rolling to it that means that there is just more dynamism and cube equity in playing a deck like this. The biggest weakness that the Ramp deck has is predictability and a limited number of points. This deck fully addresses that weakness. One trend in the metagame is that we have come pretty far from the extremely Cosmic Ghost Rider heavy metagame we were in only a few weeks ago. Every mid-range deck was packing a CGR, ready to get rid of anything that needed to actually use its abilities on the board. This is definitely no longer true. CGR especially is particularly embarrassing into a Ramp matchup. It's just not that good. And so that means that there are less CGRs, and they don't even necessarily make it into the deck that typically plays them, which is the Ramp deck, because of the competition for spots at 5 between Cosmic Ghost Rider and Legion and Enchantress and really anything else that you'd want to put in that space. This means that you can get a lot more out of Jocasta combo decks than you used to be able to. Now, I do believe this also applies to Invisible Woman First Steps versions of Jocasta combo decks, but I think this is a really good build right now because it is able to do this while also maintaining a backup plan. You don't have to be a Jocasta deck, you can also be a Surfer deck. And that's not the greatest thing in the world, but if your opponent is taking their entire turn to get rid of your Jocasta stuff and spending all of that on only 6 power, your backup plan can actually beat what they're doing. That's the basic premise of this deck. I believe it's very similar to the original Smiz version of this list. It might actually be just the same list updated for a different time and a different place. And it goes to show just how much context defines what is and is not a good deck. I think a lot of people look at good decks as a sort of abstract thing. This deck is good because it is good. There is a quality to it that it has that is inherent that makes it good. But a lot of decks in Marvel Snap output a lot of points, and what makes them differentiate themselves from each other, becoming good and bad, is whether or not those points are easily interactable with, and whether or not those points are more than the points other people are doing. And those are both very contextual questions. The metagame has gotten a little bit smaller and a little bit cheaper. As it has gotten cheaper, Cosmic Ghost Rider has gone out of the metagame. As it has gotten smaller, you see things like Ramp rising up because you have to play fair stats because everyone's playing Shadow King. So when everyone is playing Shadow King, you have to be playing fair stats that are actually the numbers on the cards. And if you're playing cards that are actually the numbers on the cards, that ceiling is naturally, and this might seem a little like contradictory, but it makes sense if you think about it. It's a lot harder to get to really unfair numbers if you're just playing the numbers on the cards than it is when you're mixing their abilities together in multiplicative ways. And because of that, the point ceiling in this metagame is less than it was previously. And the interactivity, i.e. the amount of Cosmic Ghost Rider when it comes to this deck in this metagame is less than it was previously, which makes this deck a little bit of a hidden gem. Another example of a deck like this is, of course, the ongoing list. This is the one that has been put together by Gamer, and you can tell because there's a Scarlet Witch in it. Believe me, that is the flex spot of all flex spots. Of course, if it were me, I would simply flex an anti-venom into that spot because that is my version of what Gamer's Scarlet Witch is. The larger point here, though, is that ongoing stuff was another deck that was pretty heavily policed by Cosmic Ghost Rider, much less so by Shadow King, and can do a lot of points into a lot of reasonable stuff. This was a deck that was held back by Deafening Chord as well, and as Victoria Hand has gotten worse into the ramp matchups, Deafening Chord Shadow King as a package has also sort of fallen off. What I'm noticing here is a sort of trend based on the rise of ramp that pushes the dominant mid-range decks out of sorts, and until they figure out what it is they're actually teching against, and until that happens, there's kind of a lot of room for combo-esque decks or combo-y mid-rangey decks that have these interactive pieces but just have a ton of points in them as well, to succeed in ways that they weren't able to do in a very enforced metagame where move was bigger than them, so why are we even bothering? And that is no longer true now. There are a bunch of things that have led to this. I've talked about the downtick in Cosmic Ghost Rider, but I do think it's worth talking about move in this context too, because move is not necessarily all that much worse, but the ceiling is lower enough that all of these other combo decks can really come out to play now in a meaningful way. And because all of these other combo decks can come out to play now in a meaningful way, there's just less ability for one deck to focus on just beating the biggest combo deck, because all of these decks require different kinds of answers. Like, yeah, you know, you might get Enchantress, but you know what's actually a really good card against a decent amount of the kind of things that a ramp deck is going to do? If you guess where their Electro is and you Cosmo it, that's a really good play too. And it means that you have a safe lane that you can dodge all their Enchantress stuff in. Like, there's just a lot going on here that makes this deck have a bunch of points that is really powerful, multiple ways to protect its points from the one deck that plays Enchantress, and very few mid-rangey decks that go up into Cosmic Ghost Rider, in large part because most of those mid-rangey decks that scale up into Cosmic Ghost Rider were zombie decks that got forced out of the metagame by this kind of stuff anyway. I think Sauron is one of those perennially underrated archetypes because it's just kind of boring, but I had so much success with discard that it was pretty hard for me to believe that Sauron just wouldn't be a good deck at this point. I find it very hard to believe that this is something that is actively bad, since combo decks are all just like, what's the best one of us, right? There's going to be all these weird mid-range decks running around. This is an open metagame. Neither mid-range nor combo has figured out what the best version of itself is, and that means that you can just play stats. Like, this feels to me like a sort of extended grace period of a metagame. We just still haven't figured out what's actually supposed to be happening. We went from V-Hand is clearly on top to a lot of different potential decks doing pretty well. And in a world where there's just a lot of options, one really dominant and powerful position to take is to say, I'm bigger than most of these. You're not going to be bigger than all of them, but you're going to be bigger than most of them. If you have a good draw here, you're just outputting the ramp decks. Like, that's just what's happening here. If you have a good draw here, you're outputting the discard decks. When you compare the top-end cards, you compare Scar to Weapon H. Weapon H is this cool card. Yeah, it's 14 power. What Scar rewards you for doing is so much better than what Weapon H rewards you for doing. What Scar rewards you for doing, again, 112 a lot of the time, is just playing big guys. That's a really good way to win Marvel Snap games. That's what's happening here. That's what that card rewards you for doing. Weapon H requires you to go out of your way. This deck's just literally you play the cards in it. There's no like, oh, I gotta worry about my zombie Power Man order. No, you play the cards and then Scar costs less. That's it. And that's just a really, really powerful space to exist in. From Roram, we have a deck that is all about final turn point output in just weird ways. There is, of course, the High Evo and Abomination combo that is going to convert some of the stats we get into some cheaper cards. There is Roramammu, which hooks into the High Evo Abomination thing by afflicting people, also gets some kills down so we can Morgan Le Fay them back for even more stats. That's kind of the whole vibe here, is just like recycling and repeating. It's almost like a more mid-rangey version of the Jet Phoenix Force deck, where that deck is built to do that maximally. This deck is built to do it for like a mid-rangey advantage. This is a classic Marvel Snap deck that goes out of its way to do things in weird ways, but fundamentally, when you really zoom out as to what this deck is doing, what it's doing is a bunch of power on turn 6 for not a lot of energy. This is a strategy as old as Marvel Snap. It's just setting that up in various ways that are not typically ones that you are going to be familiar with. But what this deck is effectively trying to do is spend 5 turns building a hand of just a bunch of really cheap garbage, while sometimes it's also building the board while it does that, thanks to the symbiotes Carnage and Venom, and of course Roramammu itself. This is a deck that is able to generally output a bunch of power on the final turn of the game, which means that it is a very high agency deck. The more you are able to understand your range and your opponent's range, the better you're going to be at playing this. I would argue this is one of the harder mid decks in the game. This is not like, wow, it's the greatest deck ever, but there's something that's kind of a secret at high levels of play. And it's that any deck that has enough player agency and enough points is going to be able to succeed in a game of Marvel Snap by being smarter about where those points actually go. This is because there are generally only, and by generally I mean always, 4 slots at a location, and investing properly in each of them can allow a deck that outputs less points to beat a deck that outputs more points. Imagine a deck outputting 75 points, 25, 25, 25 on all locations. That's a better deck than the deck that outputs 60 points. But if the deck that outputs 60 points puts it in 30, 30, 0, it's going to win that game. That dynamism is why decks like this are consistently able to succeed at high levels, because players at high levels are simply better at estimating what the actual numbers on the board are going to be at the end of the game and how much they have to devote to those things in order to win them. That is what this deck is stressing. What I worry about with you playing it, presumably person watching this, is that maybe the sort of intricacies of the deck, like all the weirdness of like being a Morgan Le Fay Roramammu deck, all the stuff you have to think of there, will distract you from just like thinking about power distribution on the final turn of the game. I think there's a learning curve in how to understand how to play this deck, and then also in just like the being good at the game part that this deck stresses on turn 6, the metagame knowledge, all of that stuff. So it is, I think, an interesting and fun space to play around in. I tend to have a blast playing Roramammu decks. Lord knows that. You can tell because I have that variant. That was a 2,400 gold variant for a card that not many people play a lot of. That is an interesting space, but it is sort of fundamentally a skill deck. Last up, perhaps the greatest Jay Wallacook of all time. This is Thanos C3. Now, what this deck is trying to do is effectively provide Cerebro with a backup plan. One of the issues Cerebro has in this metagame is that it's just a little bit awkward when it's not able to fully combo off, and it actually has a pretty decent amount of like good utility cards that happen to have 3 power and play for way more than that, like Omega Sentinel. What this deck is trying to do is allow Thanos to supplement the game plan. You don't draw Cerebro, that's fine. You're like a fairly medium but still functional Thanos deck. You do some reasonable stuff. You do draw Cerebro, okay, well, we just don't play the Thanos. That's fine by me. We're just not doing that. and you end up having a board-wide buff that 0 people who play against you will ever expect. This deck has so much power built into it. There are so many cool things you can do in this space. This is also a deck that is quite good at being a Valkyrie deck, which is a weirdly important, not necessarily important, but a weirdly good card right now. People are playing like cards that are just really big bodies, you know? Oh, check out my, you know, Electro and Infinite. And like, yeah, okay. Well, what if they just weren't cards, right? Like, what if those things just didn't exist? And that kind of thing is what Valkyrie is bringing, a sort of Shang-Chi-ish aspect to this metagame. You have a lot of things that make this deck just do reasonably powerful stuff. Like, good amounts of numbers in unexpected ways is a really powerful strategy, and that's what this deck is leveraging. You can play it as a Cerebro deck with a Thanos backup plan, a Thanos deck with a Cerebro high roll. Like, there really is a surprising amount of ability to just be a Thanos deck when you play this. Like, it is a little bit shocking, but like, I think even more shocking is how much Cerebro power you're going to be making and how confused your opponents are going to be when it happens. Because again, we talk a lot about high level Marvel Snap being about identifying, you know, how many points are they going to have in this location. And a deck like Thanos often ends up using a lot of its early plays on guys that don't have a lot of points in them, because that's what happens when you play cards in the early game, right? This deck does that, but it also manages to back buff those cards with Cerebro, which means that a lane that has a Power Stone and a Jeff in it, you might be looking at that and you're like, okay, you know, they're not going to put that much more power in there. And then they are going to put that much more power in there. That is actually going to happen. And I think that kind of dynamic is a pretty interesting one to try to exploit. This is a deck that is, I think, actually legitimately underrated. People will look at this and they'll be like, it's a meme deck. Kinda, but I've lost to this. Like, that's a real thing. Like, it didn't feel like it was like, oh, I got really unlucky to lose. It was like, oh yeah, I get Cerebroed here and I die. And that's real. Like, this is a pretty actually legitimately strong deck, as weird as that sounds. All right, y'all. I hope you enjoyed this look at the diversity of the metagame. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.